Today's lesson is 2-4 complex numbers, or also known as imaginary numbers. There's a few rules here that you need to remember. The square root of a negative number is I, the imaginary number I, like the square root of -1 is I. You also need to remember that I squared is -1, and those are a couple of rules that we went over last year in Algebra 2. Those are the two main things you need to remember. You also need to remember that the standard form of a complex number is a plus bi, where the real part goes first, like maybe the number 5, plus or maybe minus the imaginary part goes second. So something like 5 plus 3i. That's opposite of if the I would be an x, like if you had the expression 3x plus 5, you would put the x first and the 5 last. Imaginary numbers or complex numbers are opposite of that. You put the real part first and then the imaginary part second. So just keep that in mind as we work through our examples. So let's start down here with number 1, doing the operations. We're going to do an addition and then we'll do a subtraction and do some operations like that. So for number 1, we're going to add these two expressions together. Just collect like terms. 7 plus 5 is 12, and then 3i plus -4i would be -1i, keeping that in standard form with the real part first and the imaginary part second. And that's all there is to it. So moving along to number 2, we're going to have 3 plus 4i minus 5 minus 2i. Since you're subtracting, you need to distribute the negative sign. 3 plus 4i minus 5 plus 2i. Ooh, my pen's going crazy. So 3 minus 5 is -2, and then plus 4i plus 2i is plus 6i. Now notice how we're keeping this in standard form, numbers first, imaginary part second. Okay, number 3. We are going to multiply here, so we're going to distribute 8i to both of these. So 8i times 4 is 32i, and 8i times -3i is -24i squared. Now, look at the very top of your notes. I'll have to scroll back for mine, but look at this rule right here. I squared is -1. You never leave an I squared in your answer. I squared is -1, so you replace that with -1. So this actually ends up being -24 times -1, which ends up being +24. So this is 32i plus 24. Now remember, we need to put our answer in standard form, so our number goes first. 24 plus 32i. And there's our final answer there. That's supposed to be -1. So I squared right here gets replaced with -1. Alright, moving on to number 4. We're going to multiply 3 minus I times 5 plus 4i. 3 times 5 is 15. 3 times 4i is plus 12i. There's -5i, and there's -4i squared. So in here I see a couple of things I can do. I can combine like terms. So that's going to be 15 plus 7i, but what about that right there? I squared is -1. So this is -4 times -1, which is +4. 15 plus 4 is 19 plus 7i. So don't forget to replace your I squared with -1. Okay, down here for number 5. 5 minus 3i squared. We keep talking about this every time it comes up. If you need to write 5 minus 3i and write it twice and multiply it out the long Algebra 1 way, all this distributing, go right ahead. I'm not doing that anymore. Y'all should be able to go straight to the answer here. Square the 5, 25. Square the negative 3i. Negative 3i squared is plus 9i squared. Where does the middle come from? What's 5 times negative 3i? Well, it's negative 15i. Double it because you're going to have two of them. So that's negative 30i. So that's what you get when you square this. If you go through the long process, you'll get the same thing. Alright, I squared is negative 1. 9 times negative 1 is negative 9. 25 minus 9 is 16 minus 30i. So that's what you get on number 5. Okay, in this next section we're going to be working with some square roots. We're going to simplify and write our answer in standard form. And we're dealing with negatives under the square root sign, and on our rule up there at the top, remember the square root of a negative number, and negative 1 was our example, is the imaginary number I. And before we start multiplying or doing anything here, we need to take care of these negatives under the square root signs. So the square root of a negative 14 would be I square root of 14 times square root of negative 2 would be I square root of 2. So basically you need to pull the i's out in the front before you do anything else. Now we're ready to multiply. When you multiply square roots, you multiply the outsides together and you multiply the insides together. So multiply these together, and on the outside you're going to get I squared, and on the inside you're going to get 28. We all know by now that I squared is negative 1. So we have a negative 1 on the outside. Inside the square root, I need to simplify or break down the square root of 28. Well, that's 4 times 7. The square root of 4 is 2. And 2 times my negative 1 that's out there is going to be negative 2 square root of 7. And that would be my final answer. Negative 2 square root of 7. Alright, on number 7, we're not multiplying, but we're subtracting, but we need to do the same thing. We need to simplify these before we do anything else. Pull the I out here, minus, pull the I out there. Now I need to simplify square root of 27 and square root of 12. 27 is 9 times 3. 12 is 4 times 3. So this will simplify into 3i square root of 3 minus 2i square root of 3. So if you have 3i square root of 3's minus 2i square root of 3's, that's going to leave you with 1i square root of 3. Now I want to point something out to you because you all have the solutions guide. We gave you all the solutions guide, and I want to let you know that the book is going to write these differently. The book will write these different. Book writes these differently. I'm just going to abbreviate. Here's how your book is going to write this, and I don't like it this way, and I will not encourage you to write it this way, but your book is going to write this as square root of 3 with the I behind it. And the reason I don't really care for that is because here's what some of you will do. You'll do this, and you'll stick the I under the square root sign because you will extend the square root. So I'm not telling you that you can't write it that way, but I would not encourage it because you'll try to extend the square root. But just to let you know, when you go to check your answer, this is what you'll see in the back of the book, but I would encourage you to write it this way. This is what you're used to from what we did last year in Algebra 2. Okay, but just so when you go to check it in the back of the book, here's how the book will write the answer. Alright, just for checking purposes. Alright, moving along to number 8. Now, when you have something like this and you're going to square it, remember that means you're going to multiply it by itself. So let's go through our shortcut here. You're going to square negative 2, which is positive 4, and you're going to square the square root of negative 5, which means you're going to multiply this by itself. I need to pull the I out there first, don't I? So maybe we need to do that first. How about negative 2 plus I square root of 5? squared. So negative 2 squared is 4. I square root of 5 squared. I square root of 5 times itself is going to be I squared square root of 25. If you multiply that by itself. Right now for the stuff here in the middle, multiply those times each other, which is going to be negative 2I square root of 5, and double it. It's going to be negative 4I square root of 5. And if you want to write it twice and distribute, go for it. Okay, let's simplify this a little bit here. I squared is negative 1, and the square root of 25 is 5. So this is going to be 4 minus 4I square root of 5. Negative 1 times 5 is negative 5. 4 minus 5 is negative 1 minus 4I square root of 5. So that's what you get on number 8. And one more in this little section. Alright, 4I squared. I squared is negative 1. So 4 times negative 1 is negative 4. Okay, now look over here. Negative 2. Inside I cubed, right? Inside I cubed, I have an I squared times an extra I. Okay, I cubed is I squared times an extra I, because if you add those exponents, that gives you 3 i's. So hidden in this I cubed, I do have an I squared. And I squared is negative 1. So that's negative 2 times my negative 1 from my I squared times my extra leftover I. So if you multiply that together, negative 2 times negative 1 is positive 2 times I is positive 2I. And that's how that one works out.